So this is a talk that was requested for people wanting to learn more about how to manage projects in Obsidian. I don't think I'm an expert, but I have been doing enough fiction for long enough in Obsidian that I at least hopefully have some insight to share. And with no further ado, here we go. So to start with, I am a big believer in cite your sources. And if I'm going to be sitting here telling you ways that you should do things or ways to think about things, I should at least tell you who I am. I use speculative fiction as a framing device. It's kind of how I view the world. So most of my vault and organization and note-taking is filtered through the lens of I am world building a fictional world. I am creating a fantasy world or a science fiction world. And that helps me process my notes. But also I have always sort of wanted to be a published author. Since I was a little kid, I've been writing stories since like 3rd grade. So that's how I process information, and it really informs my note-taking, but also it informs my organizational structure because I'm doing more than note-taking for my own sort of personal knowledge. I am also creating articles and things to share with the world and stories that I send out with people and pursuing publication in professional magazines and that sort of thing. So that's my background. And if that is not one of your goals, then don't take everything I say as a thing that you should be integrating with your system, because everybody's systems are very personal. But I do have an academic background. I went to law school, I passed the bar. I'm not like a random person who's, still in 3rd grade writing the very first stories. I have thought about this for a long time. So my process is sort of a little bit cyclical, but also 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's a process, there's a steps. The first thing I do is I learn stuff. I love learning. It's very fun for me. I think I saw the Readwise people describing their kind of target audience as autodidacts, and that's kind of me. So I learn stuff. That's the inspiration I take from the world. Other authors don't necessarily pursue nonfiction for their inspiration. They're more likely to, go to a cafe or have friends that inspire them or life experiences, but my inspiration usually comes from nonfiction. And then I process and synthesize the things I learn. That inspires me. I write down my ideas, I record them. However much inspiration I have at that moment, I just write it down, and then I put it in a place I can find it again. And then as I go through my sort of living in the world experiences, I will add more to that file. I'll add a snippet of a thought. I'll sort of create more. I'll connect it to something. I'll relate it to something. I'll synthesize an idea, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And when I'm ready to start writing, I will sit down and look for something appropriate to whatever I'm writing for. So if I see a call from a fantasy magazine that's looking for a piece about food for an upcoming open submission window, I will try to look through what I have already and see what can most appropriately be built out for that. Then I expand on it as appropriate. I make sure that I've updated my metadata where I talk about the status of the file, and then I ship it and I move the folder, and the process, I don't want to say begins anew because I'm kind of always learning stuff, but that's kind of how it goes. So the most important thing for me is inspiration. Like, there's more than one way to be inspired, but I think that depth and good fiction that I enjoy is very informed by people living in the world. I've read things that are written by teenagers a lot for my job, and I've read things that were written by people who have had 3 and 4 careers behind them. And I personally enjoy the stories that are told by people like Glenn Cook and Lee Modesitt that have life experience behind them. That's harder to do when you're writing about sort of like the Bronze Age of a world. So I learn that way. But no matter where you get your inspiration from, I think it's important to be inspired because it adds depth and realism to storytelling. I have gone over sort of in excruciating detail how I read nonfiction sources and do all of that. You can find that on the Linking Your Thinking channel. There's a sorry, there's a page on my blog. You can find those resources. But the point is that I distill all of the stuff I read into claims and questions, and I make it a point to relate them to the things that I could be writing. So if I find a cool idea, I will make a note that's like, I could use this for a story about this concept, or I could use this to flesh out these people. And I find that that is helpful when I need to write something quickly for an open submission call that only has a week window. I have all of that stuff floating in my head already, so I'm not starting from scratch. Oops, that's the wrong button. So I also really do well with prompts. Not everybody does, but this is sort of more where I get into Obsidian, where yes, there are prompts sort of on Twitter. I like the Very Short Stories 365. They send a new prompt every day. But the Obsidian plugins are also really fantastic at this because you can kind of customize them for your own style. I used to really enjoy this thing called prompt bingos back in the LiveJournal days, 10 years ago when the internet was much shinier and newer. But the idea is that you can make a 5x5 card and then kind of figure out how to make bingo. And I find that incredibly inspiring. And you can do that with Obsidian. And I have actually been looking for a tool to make prompt bingos for like the last decade, because you have to sort of trick your brain into forgetting all of the things that you put into it. And like, it's not hard to program something that can make a 5x5 grid of random stuff if you're a programmer, but I'm not really a programmer. And I've been looking for these plugins for a very long time so that you can sort of seek out that inspiration. And I just find Obsidian wonderful for that. Small digression to folders and tags, which I have written about at length. But the reason that I use folders is because it lets me use a bunch of different tools. I think folders are less useful if you're just doing something like Zettelkasten, but if you are trying to manage multiple products and projects and stages of projects and resources and all of that stuff, I think folders are great, personally. This is how I manage my projects. So this is my folder system. I start with more meta things. Like, all of the high folders are inputs. They're dumps from Readwise and Zotero. They are snippets of ideas. They're journaling. They're notes. And then the farther down I go, I like the more sort of useful things I have, like character profiles and world building notes. That stuff kind of goes in the middle, but I try very hard to keep all of my ideas in Obsidian as notes. But one thing that's important is that I don't sit down and try to create a wiki of my world. I did that like before I found Obsidian. I had a Wikimedia instance and I tried to create a world Bible, the way that you see like Game of Thrones will have a Bible and each page has a bunch of information about each character. But the more I used Obsidian notes, the more I realized that that's not necessary as such, because it's a lot of work and you always have to decide, or I'm sorry, you always have to determine whether or not the work you're putting in is worthwhile. Like, there's only so many hours in the day, and your note-taking system can be extraordinarily thorough, but that costs time, and I prefer to use that time for writing the product. So I try to only write down the notes that I need when I'm in danger of forgetting something, when it's not explicit in the text of what I've written, or when I have so many things that are in so many different places that I need to consolidate and synthesize. So I try to only do that when I'm sort of getting overwhelmed. I don't start from, all right, I'm going to sit down and write about this culture. I almost do like a bullet point, just kind of slap information down. And I can show some examples of that. I actually just pushed an update of my notes live to the publish that we can look at the end. So I'm assuming that most people kind of read this slide, but I have a folder for deleted scenes. I have a folder for completed stuff. I separate out my markdown files from like the format that I have to actually send things to publications in using Pandoc. And really the TLDR here is that I don't think you can do this without folders. Like, I don't think you can manage a complex a complex project workflow without some way to differentiate. And I'm using tags to differentiate other things. And like, I'm using YAML notes for other stuff, and folders are really good at what they're good at. They're good at interacting with things like Pandoc, and they're good at having things in different places when you just need to know which story is done and which story isn't done. And clicking complete when I'm looking for something that's ready to ship is so much easier than running a search. For me personally, everybody's different, but this folder system like kind of is how I manage the projects. I know it, like, I don't know if that's disappointing because I've been talking about folders for ages, but like, that's the answer. The answer is that I keep it organized, and I do that with folders. But I do have some useful templates that have helped me a lot. I find aliases, like, I don't actually use the backlinks that much. I do sometimes, but I mostly have other ways of doing it. But it's super useful for sort of like a janky search. Like, I'll alias a particular article to something that I might have accidentally called it on my phone, and it helps me pick up all of the different like typos that I could have made. I don't use tags very often, but I do for articles, because there are times where I'll have articles in more than one folder. Like, sometimes I will have articles that are part of my newsletter, which wasn't the original system, but I wasn't going to completely like rip it all out and start from scratch. I have tags for articles that I ship with my newsletter once a week, and also for articles that I ship with my blog. And then sometimes, like, I write for World Building Magazine, and sometimes I have articles, but sometimes I have blog posts, and they're different. So I differentiate subtypes. So sometimes I write kind of like essays, and sometimes I write book reviews, and it helps me see at a glance when I look at my data view tables what kind of thing something is, which is super useful for figuring out what I want to work on at any given time. I also, for a long time, I only kept track of the status that I updated something, but I found it useful to know how long something had been brewing. And then I also try to keep track of what I could ship something for, because I like to have as much out in the world as possible. So if I have an idea and then I send it in and they say yes, and then I finish my article for a publication, I want to send them something else now that I'm done that. And I need to know what is suitable for them. So I have a very similar story I have a very similar template for stories that I do for nonfiction articles. And it's the same idea of I can send this to whatever publication. But with stories, I keep track of what sort of broader universe that story is. I try to keep track of when it takes place. I'm not always the best about that. Like, I don't always have a set year, because a lot of the time I'll know that it takes place before one story but after another story, and I haven't pinned down the timeline of my universe yet, but it still lets me see at a glance on the data view query when it takes place, and I can then look at all of them at once and put them together. I try to keep track of the protagonists and which characters are in it, again, for the data view tables, and where the story takes place, and that will make more sense in a moment, I hope. But the place where data view shines is that you can summarize your story or your chapter, and then data view will let you see the summaries of all of your stories at a glance, or all of your chapters at a glance, which tags just can't do. So that's where data view shines as opposed to tags, in my opinion, is that you can pull out summaries and like meaningful metadata like it's not just tagging, you know, this character, this character, this character. It's a whole sentence of this story is about a character who is trying to save her village from, you know, evil mushrooms. And then you can see that. So here's an example of that. And again, note that my notes for this location, this is not something you would see on like the Game of Thrones wiki. This is useful really more for me than it is for anyone else. But these are the kinds of details that I might otherwise forget. Like these are names that make sense for this region that I can pull from as necessary. Here's a description, but also this is all of the stories that have taken place in this location, which is really useful for me to see when I'm dealing with a bunch of different stories. A lot of people will write sort of like one novel at a time, and that's awesome for them. But I have a toddler and I can't juggle something that big right now. So I'm writing a lot of short stories in a shared world, and they're very interlinked and very related, and keeping track of which ones are related in all of the different ways is really hard to do without Obsidian. I don't think I could have told a storyline this complicated, but also stories so simple and straightforward without this kind of data view. Like a data view made this possible. So there are the queries. You can, I'm happy to share the slide deck at the end, but hopefully this gives you guys a sense of what I mean when I'm talking about I just dump the thoughts into the file and data view helps me see the relevant stuff. So here's an example for markets, and you can do the same thing with fiction markets, like Apex Magazine or Clarkesworld or any one of the. I have basically the same thing for them, but I use the Grinder, which is a website that tracks fiction submissions really, really, really well from Diabolical Plots. And as awesome as Obsidian is, it is not actually an API shared across several tens of thousands of people. So it's like, But the nice thing about DataView is that you can sort by file size. So things that you have put more effort into and more thoughts into kind of rise to the top. And then when it's, oh gosh, I have a deadline in 2 days and I need to ship something, I can see the easiest thing to ship and then I can polish it off. And it really works well for, I think they call it incremental writing, but the idea is that you slap some ideas down as you have them, and you slap some ideas down as you have them, and you slap some ideas down as you have them, and then eventually there's a whole bunch of ideas in one place and you can go write it, and it's really straightforward. And yes, it's still a wiki-like structure in that it's interlinked and thoughts are shoved in there and you can kind of see the characters and the areas, but I don't worry about sitting down and typing it out in sentences and something that's like forward viewing. Like it's not an essay about this location in my world, it's notes. Like it's very genuinely notes and not an explanation. I hope that makes more sense. So this I picked up from Ryan, actually. Hi, Ryan. I don't use URIs, or there's some debate about whether they're URIs or URLs, but I don't use them often, but they're actually fantastic for keeping track of email chains with different markets. So when I have when I pitch to Tor, I pitch to Sifwa, they will sort of respond to my emails, which is nice. And then instead of using all kinds of organizational systems in my email that frankly I tried for like a week and it just gives me hives, so I keep all of my organization in Obsidian. I've gone full inbox zero with my email, and then I just link to the relevant email chain in my notes, which is super helpful. And then I also kind of reword in my own words what a market wants. So sneak peek for how Sifwa does things and how much they pay. But it helps cut down on the wasted time of skimming their long form stuff. And yeah, so I think that's the kind of the gist of it. And then there was the original request for this talk included a bonus, if you have time, could you talk about marketing fiction? And I I don't know that I am the best authority on marketing. Like my newsletter has like 400 subscribers and like most of you guys found me from Obsidian. But I do have like very genuinely a whole bunch of friends who are professionals, professional writers, and like I've paid attention over a lot of years, so I have some decent insight, I hope to think. So my concern, like my notes about platform and marketing, I keep all of that in Meta. I keep track of marketing tips that seem relevant to me, and then I kind of glance through them as necessary. So if I see a Twitter thread that is exceedingly insightful, I will record it. If I come across a blog post from someone I respect that has an insight I might be able to use in 10 years, I write it down. But all of that is meta for me. That's not the core of my notes. And I actually usually make an effort to not have too many notes about note taking and notes about marketing, because I feel like it's a rabbit hole I don't personally want to go down. People keep asking me if I want to do courseware or sell, and I don't actually. I'm very happy over here in my stay-at-home mom corner. But this is an idea for how to organize those kinds of things. And yes, they are processed. I can talk about processing my notes later. But the most important thing to do with marketing, in my opinion, is to keep track of your marketing. There was a time when I would just sort of, hey, this is cool, I did this, as relevant. And then I started to lose track of where I had shared what to, especially as I would find a new place that was sort of interested in things I had to say. Like there's a subreddit about Phoenicia that is shockingly active, and I do a lot with Phoenicia, but I don't want to accidentally share the same thing twice to them. So at the top of my files, I will say, I shared, this folder or this file to this place. Here's where I shared it. So I can keep track of what marketing is such a weird word for a blog post I wrote, but what marketing I've done to promote a product that I've done. And there's a program called Missing Letter that I picked up like for a $40 one-time thing years ago on a sale. I don't even remember how I found it, but I got it super cheap, and it helps me automate my Twitter stuff. And Zoom just gave me a giant pop-up that removed the 40-minute time limit on our group meeting. Sorry, that was my face. My face was the giant pop-up on my screen. Sorry. So yeah, the best marketing advice I ever heard was to find your people. And I like to think that you guys are my people. I feel like I found you guys my people. But the idea is that you should find people who are actually interested in what you have to say and let it come up naturally in conversation. And from my perspective, it's worked wonderfully to just diffidently hand out, hey, I found a cool thing that's relevant and I made it. Do you guys like it? And it turns out that you do. So thank you. I don't know if that's helpful marketing advice, but I don't know. It's what I do. My newsletter exists because I heard from a friend who is a full-time self-published author that newsletters are the hot new thing for actually interacting with your audience. And I've heard a lot of creators complain that places like Facebook and Twitter, like the algorithms control your life, and you can't really access the people who actually want to be accessed. Like you can't connect with people that want to be connected with very well. So newsletters are a way around that, because people who want to hear you can find you without the fire hose. And that seemed true to me. So I had in the back of my head to start a newsletter if I could think of a reason to ever have one. But I don't have a published book. I'm not writing a new book every month. I don't do the things that professional self-published authors do. And then it occurred to me that it would be fun to share my research and interesting stuff that I was already telling people about with them via email. So my newsletter actually started as a thing that I sent to like my father and my father-in-law and a handful of nerdy friends. And yes, I will share these slides. And it grew from that. But I don't know that, I don't know. Where am I going with this? I don't know that everyone should have a newsletter. I have a friend who just got agented, and she's thinking about setting up a newsletter, and she's trying to figure out what her newsletter should be about. And for a lot of people, your newsletter should be once every 6 months you send a note that says your book is published, and that's enough. So it depends on what kind of content you're creating and what you find interesting and what your niche is. My niche is just nerdy history stuff. So I don't know, it worked for me, I guess. But Reddit is a surprisingly good place to find your people. Unlike Twitter and Facebook, Reddit actually subdivides people by interest. So you can find people who are interested in your niche thing. So some articles and some stories and some things I share to Reddit on world building or our Phoenicia or, like wherever it's relevant. And I get a almost shocking number of hits. Even like the Obsidian subreddit isn't terribly active. Like there aren't a lot of posts, but definitively most of my traffic comes from like those subreddits. So if you're looking at me for marketing tips, my advice is Reddit's great. And I have just enough time to talk about the iceberg, which is basically, what did I think about? I organize that information into what is essentially a synthesized atomic note. And then I schedule it, I share it, I continue sharing it as appropriate, and then I talk about it. And that's it. Like that's how I market things. I talk about interesting things that I learned. I don't know that that worked for everyone because not everybody writes the same way I do, but I don't know, you guys showed up and you know who I am, so that's how I do it.